The future has arrived. As the world and humanity itself moves faster and faster into unimaginable possibilities, old institutions that built connection and shaped our sense of meaning are falling by the wayside. In their wake, profound questions about ethics, our purpose, and spirituality demand new answers. Join your host, Scott Mason, in Season 2 of the Purpose Highway podcast. We will explore how these social changes will revolutionize our society. We will learn how they impact our own search for connection and meaning. And we will hear stories of influencers whose lives have had radical change from the inside and found profound connection to others and themselves through a new definition of meaning. The future has arrived. Are you ready?
When you're racing down the Purpose Highway, we want to make sure you're healthy and happy every step of the way. That's why we're proud to partner with It's NOLA, 21st century plant-based healthy granola snack bites made with real ingredients and audacious flavor. It's NOLA crafts small batch hand-rolled granola balls that are vegan, gluten-free, and naturally low in sugar. It's NOLA's delightful bites come in 3 flavors: luscious cranberry coconut, sassy mango masala, and dark, decadent, chewy chocolate. It's NOLA is available to both individual customers and for wholesale accounts at itsnola.com. That's ITSNOLA.com. Guests on this show are already enjoying this delicious snack. Check out It's NOLA's website for yourself and find out how good it is. Hello everybody, it's Scott Mason, revving up for another race down the Purpose Highway. Today, we're going to have part 2 of our interview with Melody Stanford Martin. Now, before we get started, I just want to remind you, if you like what we're doing, be sure to subscribe and give us a thumbs up on YouTube or a positive review on Apple. Last time, when we talked to Melody, who's a social ethicist, we discussed the importance of understanding the role of systems when we make choices around our ethics and our morals. And the reason why those systems mattered being that those systems are ultimately what connect us to each other. If we're not looking at entire systems surrounding our choices, we may actually make choices that not only harm others, but harm ourselves. We also talked about the role of capitalism and the free flow of money as a system, both as a tool to connect to each other or, when abused, to sever social connection. Finally, we talked about being grateful for what we have, but understanding the true origin of the financial and other social gifts that we've been given so that we could make appropriate, well thought through, and impactful moral choices with how we act. Today, we're going to talk about spirituality and much, much more. Melody is back in the house. So let's talk about this. One of the things that was interesting that you raised during our pre-interview discussion was that you saw a link between evangelicism, if I pronounce that correctly. Boy, I'm stumbling over words left and right myself today. And consumerism. And you felt there were spiritual implications to that which were impacting our culture. And I would, again, state that few people would argue that one of the most divisive issues in our current culture is around the role of religion. Talk to us a little bit around your thinking on that topic.
How much time do you have?
Girl, get started.
Okay, let's do it. So, as you know, I was raised Pentecostal, fundamentalist Pentecostal. and my parents were ministers. And
For those who don't know, what exactly is Pentecostal? What is life like as a Pentecostal minister's child?
Sure. So one of my earliest memories, I was about 4 years old, was handing out tissues to people, Kleenex to people who were at an altar call, which, if you've ever been to a Pentecostal service, you know that an altar call is the pastor gives a fiery, 45-minute sermon. The musicians, the band starts to play, and then the pastor says, come to the front of the stage and, get down on your knees and pray and ask God for XYZ. So people come, and it's oftentimes a very emotional experience, people sobbing and crying and praying and crying out to God, often for hours. And so my earliest memory is walking around as a 4-year-old child, giving Kleenex to the adults who were pouring out their heart to God.
Wow.
And speaking in tongues.
Speaking in tongues, wow.
Pentecostals speak in tongues, so that's the characteristic in particular. So you might have charismatic churches. So the charismatic churches is the umbrella, and then Pentecostal would be like a sub-umbrella. Charismatic churches believe in the manifestations of the Holy Spirit, so they might have a spirit of laughter and collectively laugh. Some of them see gold dust falling from the ceiling when they experience the presence of God. It kind of manifests by signs and wonders. They believe in healing. They believe in miracles. Many believe in getting slain in the spirit, kind of going into an alternate mental state and falling backwards physically. You might have seen footage of
videos.
Yeah. So Pentecostalism actually gave rise to jazz in many ways. Pentecostal churches. There's a strong link between speaking in tongues and scatting in jazz.
I never knew that.
The improvisation. Yeah, I'm a jazz artist, so I've kind of read up about this a little bit. The improvisation of the music ebbing and flowing. There's a strong link between that and jazz music, right? So there's the improvisation in the moment of everyone feeling the same spirit and moving in the same way at the same time.
Wow.
Yeah. And sociologists have, like Max Weber, studied charisma and studied, actually, there's kind of instances of this sort of religious practice all over the world as far as different religious traditions, like from voodoo to divination to Pentecostalism, of kind of having this group ecstatic spiritual experience where everyone's moving together, everyone's doing the same practice at the same time, kind of going into altered mental states and things like that. So I'm speaking right now as someone who considers myself post-Christian with a strong interest in Druidry and paganism. So I'm not one of these post-Christian folks who wants to stick up their middle finger at Christianity, because I have a lot of my best friends are Christian progressive clergy and chaplains. I think if your faith tradition makes you a good person in the world, let's go back to that. If it makes you a more loving person in the world who wants to make the world a better place, then I don't want to take that from you. So I want to be very clear. I'm not trying to take anyone's faith from them. But my experience of Pentecostalism was very characteristic of cult-like behaviors. There are about 14 to 15 characteristics of cults. If you go to cultresearch.org, you can see one cult expert has outlined what those are. The tradition I grew up in hit about 11 out of 14 as far as, like I said, altered mental states, but very high control. We call them high religious control environments. Sometimes that's easier for people to digest than thinking about, did I grow up in a cult? Did I not?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, right? That's very off-putting to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Was it a high religious control environment? Was there a high ideological control? Was there emotional manipulation? Did they discourage you from hanging out with outsiders? Were they obsessed with making money and bringing new people in? There's a lot of categories. There's a lot of characteristics in that vein. So that was my experience. And I know a lot of very well-meaning people in this realm. I don't think that there was a lot of maliciousness, but the way the community was structured was very cult-like. So I've made my way out of that and have been trying to find a path that feels more authentic to me. Yeah. And that's caused a lot of pain in my family because my parents are still very devout Pentecostals. So Anyway, what was the original question?
So, and it's great that you raised that because I would have gone there next anyway. But the real question was to the extent to which you felt that a lot of the evangelical movement, which presumably includes Pentecostals within it, although it's not exclusively that, has come to be associated with consumerism and the impact of that connection on division in our society and what that means from a social ethics perspective.
Thank you. So Pentecostalism is considered definitely within the vein of evangelicalism, to my knowledge. Evangelical means that they are mostly conservative Christians who believe that their job is to go and make disciples in the world. So they evangelize. That's what makes them evangelicals. So they are constantly trying to tell people about Jesus in order to be, so that's part of their identity. If you take that away, they're no longer evangelical. Okay. So evangelicalism really can be traced back to, well, it kind of can be traced back to the very first wave, like the tent meetings, the Great Awakening, all the way back maybe to Jonathan Edwards, and then you have George Whitefield, some of these like kind of traveling itinerant preachers who had this big revival meetings in the 18th and 19th centuries. But where our modern version of evangelicalism really got started and got really popularized was through the work of Billy Graham in the 1940s and 50s. You'll remember around that same time, all the GIs were coming home from World War II. And we had a huge economic boom because all those factories that were making bombs and ships and airplanes could be converted to making dishwashers and vacuum cleaners. So you have, at the same time, I think it's fascinating, and I'm sure there are scholars who know more about this particular link than I do, but I have read quite a bit, and I think it's fascinating that this faith structure that arose with buy dishwasher, buy American, spend your money, let's buy things, buy, arose at the same time as accept Jesus, right? Speak these magic words. Pardon me if this is offensive to you, but speak these magic words to get your soul into heaven. ABCs of salvation. Let's buy, and let's convert other people to buying.
Well, and I also have to add, perhaps not coincidentally or maybe coincidentally, as those two trends were occurring post-World War II, we were attempting to differentiate ourselves from a communist regime in the Soviet Union that was explicitly anti-consumerist and explicitly atheistic.
Yes. Bingo. That's exactly what you took the words right out of my mouth. Exactly. So again, that McCarthyism was implicit is this person, are these people Christians or are they not? Are they consumeristic capitalists or are they not? So these two shoots, these two branches, evangelicalism and consumerism in our modern era grew up together. And I think they're inextricably linked, which is why you see, I think it's really interesting that a lot of contemporary evangelicals have absolutely no problem with consumerism and what we would call prosperity gospel. These pastors with mega mansions and private jets and yada, yada, yada have no problem with that, even though there are hundreds of verses in the Bible about what I would call economic justice, what evangelicals would call economic stewardship. Giving to the poor, caring for the widow and orphan, making sure you're creating a just society where no one lacks, making sure everyone has food, right? The Bible is just absolutely saturated with those theologies, but that's not a very high, in my experience, not a very high commitment or value in current evangelicalism.
Well, that leads directly into another large theme of this show, which is the silent revolution. And the silent revolution, those who follow the show have heard ad nauseum at this point, is a revolution of thought related to the nature of spirituality, ethics, and the search for purpose, tied to the decline of the historical institutions such as traditional religions, including evangelical religions in the United States, that have been the places where people found connection through the search for meaning, as exemplified by things like purpose, ethics, and spirituality. Do you think that, as particularly, by the way, the data has shown that this decline in religiosity is being driven by generational shifts, millennials and those below, although it's also increasingly happening with older people as well. Do you believe that this tie-in of consumerism, lack of social ethics as a core moral value, and the most visible forms of Christianity in the Western world being used in this sort of ethical and thought-centered knot together, may have anything to do with the shifts in the belief systems that the silent revolution is representing?
There are a lot of factors that I could point to. I think you've touched on a couple of important ones. Evangelicalism has always had, from its conception, a very strong anti-intellectual value. As in what theologians would call nuda scriptura. I only need the Bible. I do not need other sources of reason, which is why you see a huge insurgency right now of anti-science sentiment, death of the expert. So I'm glad you said the most visible forms of Christianity, because white evangelicals only make up 14%, according to Gallup, of American voters. 14%. They're extremely vocal, 14%. I think that there are a few reasons why we're seeing that decline. First of all, the Faustian deal that evangelicals have made with Trumpism. I think that's a huge factor. I could talk a long time about that, but I won't at the moment. I think a greater understanding and education around colonization and how Christianity has been weaponized against marginalized people for centuries, and how when you start asking those critical questions of Christianity and what people have done in the name of Christ to other people to cause immense suffering, I think things start to deconstruct a little bit. I think the internet, the internet, period.
Yes.
I've talked to many people, and I've read quite a bit about the access to information, right? 50 years ago, you might stumble into the restricted section, Harry Potter style, of a library and read those dirty commie books that offered you alternate ideological perspectives. But everyone you knew went to church every Sunday. So there wasn't a lot of space to either dissent without strong social repercussions or connect with people who could offer you other ways of thinking. So with the advent of the internet, where you actually have access at a moment's notice to perspectives from 50 other walks of life at any point in time, and you carry it around with you in your pocket, that's going to probably cause you to say, oh, well, I was taught that this was the only way to read the Bible. For example, Melody, the only way to read Genesis was to believe in a literal 6-day creation. And I was taken to the, Creation Science Institute, where they research creation science, right? And I was picked up some brochures and brought them to my AP biology teacher in high school, and had this extremely awkward exchange where the teacher was trying to gently tell me that this isn't science, and I was not having it. So going to public school and being exposed to different ideas, that alone feels very threatening to people who are raised in, again, what I would call a high religious control environment. So the internet, Trumpism, what else did I say? I think also high religious control environments, high religious control systems where you have to accept, 20 different creeds, for example, in order to be part of that community. Are those communities, those systems are inherently fragile, because if you, it's like Jenga. If you pull a piece out at the bottom, then all the other pieces above that it's stacked onto that you have to accept in order to be part of that community, all those other pieces start getting a little bit less stable. And so if you start questioning things like a 7-day creation story, what else is going to topple, right? If you start looking at the Bible and saying, well, hell, the Bible doesn't talk about hell in the way I was taught to believe, or the rapture in the way I was taught to believe, it's almost like this weird domino effect that happens to a lot of people. And we call that process deconstruction. My current research for my next book is on deconstruction, so I'd love to talk a little bit more about that if you're interested. But I think there are tons of examples of tons of reasons why evangelicalism is on the decline. And I think a huge part of that is in a globalistic, pluralistic world where people have access to other points of view and other traditions and other information. It's really hard to keep the Jenga stacked. It's really hard you have to work very hard. You almost have to wrap yourself in bubble wrap so you don't have any outside experiences, any outside influences that will cause you to deconstruct. And for that reason, the word deconstruction is a really dirty word in evangelical circles right now.
Interesting. Really interesting. I love, by the way some of the episodes of this show manage to flow into each other in unexpected ways. An earlier guest on this show is a man named Mohammed Maraad. Mohammed Maraad was raised in Afghanistan under the Taliban and escaped. And one of the things he talks about at length during his interview is what it's like to grow up in a similar sort of highly repressive, high control religious environment, one that controls the culture of the country far beyond what evangelicals here in the United States could even dream about having. And he talks about, without expressing it exactly this way, but this is what my takeaway from it is, at least, that the need for self-expression and to have rational explanations for things ultimately creates this huge subconscious grudge against the controlling factor when there's no allowance for that expression and that ability to question. And his reaction was in the reverse. When he finally left Afghanistan, he hated religion forever. He didn't hate it forever, and part of his journey was discovering his own unique form of spirituality. But I just want to point this out to the audience because it may be worth revisiting that episode if you haven't had a chance to listen to it or watch it yet. It's a real life example of, at the extreme, what you're talking about and how that deconstruction can completely cause a belief system within someone to collapse. Whereas if maybe someone like him had been given an opportunity to question and think and be himself and have some differing viewpoints without risk of literally being shipped off to jail, the belief system might have been able to hold a little bit further.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because there's a lot of people of different minds who study religion. Some people are very interested in saying, religion itself isn't inherently bad. It's what we do with it. How about we reform and rescue it? There was a huge resurgence in the 20th century. So almost at the same time as you saw evangelicalism going one direction with Christianity, there was another branch that doesn't get talked about a lot, called progressive Christianity, was going on a completely different path. And they've almost diverged so much that they're different faiths at this point, different religions at this point. But amongst Jewish scholars and progressive Christian scholars, the Holocaust was this huge moment of faith crisis, because if you try to reckon with that question, the word in theology we call it is theodicy, the question of suffering. Why does suffering happen if God is good? Why doesn't God protect people from suffering if God really is all powerful? The fact that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust meant that people of faith who were often of the more intellectual bent were thrown into crisis. How could this happen if God is real? So what you saw and you saw this is the birth of Reformed Judaism, to my knowledge. Again, I'm not a Jewish expert, but Reformed Judaism versus Hasidic or Orthodox Judaism. That's where that split happened. And for progressive Christians started theorizing maybe there are other ways to look at God, and that apart from the traditional notion of God the Father, who's all powerful, omniscient, omnipresent, all of those Greek omnis that we get viewing the traditional male Christian God. Maybe, as for example, one of my favorite theologians, Paul Tillich, says, maybe God isn't anthropomorphized in the way we think. Maybe God is the ground of all being. Maybe God is the ultimate, and when we participate in life, when we experience beautiful food or great music or art or great conversation like this one, maybe we are experiencing God because God is the ground of being.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we are being. When we are human beings, we are experiencing God. And that has spun off into a lot of different directions as well. So that's where you see a fundamental shift between evangelicals would go back to a biblical literalism, reading the Bible literally, versus progressives who So going back to this idea of, do you reform faith or do you leave it? And that's what a lot of people are asking this question right now. It's very interesting to me that there are so many progressive churches in our country that affirm gay people and gay marriage and believe in science and believe in racial equity and believe in healthcare. They believe in a lot of these really progressive, quote unquote, secular ideals. But those churches are basically empty every Sunday.
Yeah.
So, and it kind of baffles me because I would think that people would want to stay in faith, but it seems like once people have deconstructed fundamentalistic religion, or like we've been talking about systems of high religious control, it seems to me like there is often a lot of trauma and a lot of resentment that has built up, and people would rather just leave faith altogether than try to reform it.
And that goes back to the Mohammed Maraad episode. When he has the discussion with me, he himself says during the interview that the trauma of growing up in this, he was still feeling it in his body to this day, even though he left the Taliban years ago. I want to also go back to another episode of this show involving a scholar by the name of Phil Zuckerman. He is the founder of the world's first secular studies academic department. And he and I discussed at length the rise of irreligiosity around the world. One of the things that I said during that interview that we had an interesting discussion around was what you just spoke about a second ago, affirmation of the LGBT community. I told him during that interview that I have always felt as a member of that community that the rise of our social acceptance would be the ultimate downfall of religion in our culture.
Wow.
But thinking about that a little bit more, I actually think I was wrong. As I was listening to you talking about the impact of World War II and the return home of the GIs and the impact of the Cold War and the rise of evangelicism and consumerism at the same time, and all this whole package of social events that occurred, I actually think that one of the roots of the beginning of the downfall of religiosity, at least as it's been expressed in the United States, occurred then that we haven't really talked about as much. And that is the rise of the civil rights movement. When you talked about the Holocaust a second ago, one of the seeds of the modern civil rights movement was the hypocrisy of us opposing the abuse of minority communities in Europe while doing the same thing here in the United States. And at the end of the day, although the civil rights movement was in large part fueled by the African American church and leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., it also laid the groundwork for the women's rights movement and ultimately was the model for the LGBTQ plus rights movement, which in terms of being a successful civil rights movement has been one of the most rapid and dramatic and effective civil rights movements in history. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't work to be done. There absolutely is. But let's face it, as late as 1967 or so, it was considered a mental disorder to be LGBTQ. Now, we have churches affirming our rights after thousands of years of oppression, of at least that as a behavior. Do you see the same relationship that I do? And talk to me about your feelings about the LGBTQA experience within the religious world and what that means for us as a culture that has been historically steeped in traditional religion.
Yeah, I have a lot of feelings about this myself. So I identify as pansexual, but I'm very straight. I am cisgender. So I'm, assigned male at birth, identify as she or they. And I am I'm married to a cis man, right? So I have what you would call a lot of straight cis privilege as someone who identifies with the gay community, but is also very much part of the straight world too. So I'm kind of a world walker, pagans would say, in a lot of ways. So I share an affinity and a strong identity, but also a strong sense of allyship to the gay community, right? And I often wonder why. So let me back up. I know a lot of gay folks who are gay clergy in Christian churches or gay members of Christian churches who find incredible healing life from being part of a church that is affirming of their marriage or their relationships or their sexuality. I have a friend who, I don't know if I can say this. I have a friend who's a gay male pastor, And when he preaches, he wears, under his robes, he wears lingerie jock straps to remind himself of like, what you can cut this if it's not appropriate.
It's appropriate. I love it. I think it's the best nugget in the episode history of this entire show. Yes. I love it.
So he wears lingerie jock straps under his robes to remind himself that his sexuality is good before God. And it's like this moment, this like aspect of rebellion for him to embrace his full self from the pulpit. And I think that's so freaking awesome and radical. I also have a trans friend, Corey Panicek, who's the first Catholic priest who has been initiated into the Catholic priesthood as a trans person, a trans non-binary person. So there are a lot of efforts to improve or promote inclusivity within progressive Christian churches, but progressive churches are still empty, and I don't quite understand why. As someone who identifies as LGBTQ, I mean, it's very difficult as someone, I came out much later in life, because if you are taught ideologically that there is no option for you to consider same-sex attraction, it's hard, especially for cis women, to even identify it, because that attraction manifests very romantically in many cases. Not always, but in many cases. So even though some of my earliest sexual experiences are being attracted to women, I was taught to suppress that so strongly in myself that it took me until I was in my 20s, until after I went through a horrible divorce and started dating again. You know, I was one of those people who did everything right. I met a nice boy in church. I saved myself for my wedding night. Tried to have this very Christian, very upstanding marriage. And then 4 years later, it crumbled. And I was out on my own again. And I guess I had a bit of a rumspringa because I hadn't realized that I didn't really know what I liked sexually. I had no idea. And so I went and tried to find out by dating. And I found out that I actually enjoyed dating women. And this became something that's like so taboo in my family.
Yeah,
I didn't tell my parents about it until much later. So it's really difficult if, again, you're raised in a system of high religious control where ideological or moral alternatives are so unacceptable that they come with very strong social ramifications, or you could say punishment, negative consequences, right? If I were to tell my parents, when I was a teenager, I'm attracted to women, all hell would have broken loose, right? And I have so many friends who actually did go through that, especially for gay men, because it's much more unavoidable how that attraction manifests physically for men, for cis men. As I'm sure you know much more about this than I do, but I do have a friend who was not only kicked out of his house by his Christian minister parents, but was told that they wished that God would take him home so he would stop sinning. I apologize. I should have given a trigger warning before that story. So.
I can handle it. And, I think it's so important to personally, and I know many people disagree with this, to actually feel the pain that comes with those sorts of stories, because it reminds us that other people are feeling it.
Yeah.
As you indicated, and as we've been talking about with regards to the whole concept of social ethics, sometimes feeling the pain of others is a sort of thing that I believe we need to be able to do in order to really understand the impact of our decisions.
Yeah.
And so we don't forget that we are not islands.
Yes.
Finish what you're saying,
that.
Please.
So the question is, can religious systems survive if they're not oppressing people? I think it's a legitimate question, right? Churches don't seem to be surviving once they become inclusive. Why is that? I mean, I want to believe that Christianity has ultimate wisdom that can continue to exist. As someone who's post-Christian, this is an interesting thing to find myself saying, but I want to believe that some types of religion have internal goodness, that when they stop being oppressive, they start being inclusive, they start accepting people of color, right? They start accepting gay people, they start promoting policies that are good for poor people. I want to believe that those systems can can keep going, right? That I think I want to believe that religion has an eternal. I think I want to believe that religion has something to offer society in a positive way. But I think that, so let me offer one perspective on this. So let me offer one perspective on this that might be a helpful thing to introduce at this point. So sociologists have a concept called ennui. Are you familiar with this idea?
I am, but I don't know that every single audience member will be, and this show is about them.
Yeah. So ennui is an idea introduced by sociologists like Emile Durkheim. It talks about the fact that a lot of what we do as humans is just to stave off chaos. Mm-hmm. The reason we organize politically, the reason we form communities and safety and religious traditions and social traditions, language is all to stave off chaos. Chaos of the natural world, chaos of even human nature, right? So that we don't hurt each other, we develop systems of exchange. Economics, exchanging money. If we exchange money, you and I, Scott, we are dependent on each other, right?
Yes.
We're interconnected.
Yes.
So in older times, in more ancient times, when we had human beings existed with a lot higher levels of ennui, right? You're walking through the desert. You have no GPS. You have no guarantee of water. You have no one coming to save you if there's a storm, no helicopters, no computers, no cars. You live on the razor's edge of ennui all the time. That, sociologists would suggest, would predispose someone to be more religious, because in the dearth of any of those other technologies or sources or resources, kind of all you have is to pray. Mm-hmm. So in the current age, when we have a lot of our basic needs met, we have access to information, we have emergency vehicles, we have helicopters, we have electricity, we have the internet. A lot of people would say maybe there's not as high of a need for God if we don't deal with ennui on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. So I think the question is, does religion offer something that's more than oppression and more than staving off chaos? Mm-hmm. And that's a question I think each of us have a right to answer. I will not answer that question for other people.
Yeah. Yeah. Although one could argue that the empty pews may be providing a pretty definitive answer of their own. That being said, I agree. Everyone has to come up with their own answer, and we're not here to answer that today. But I am here to ask you one last question before we begin to wrap up. And that is a type of post-Christian spirituality that you and I discussed during the pre-interview that I thought was fascinating. And that is politics, democracy. Yeah. What did you mean by that? Democracy as a post-religion spirituality?
Yes.
I'm terrified even here, and I don't even know what to say.
So again, in that post-World War II era, there was a resurgence of thought around, and philosophers in the 18th century and 19th century also talked about this, but there was a resurgence of this idea of how do we be good citizens in the world? How do we create a just society where things like the Holocaust cannot happen? Mm-hmm. And in a culture where religion is kind of shaking at its foundations, we need a universal way to talk about issues that aren't contingent on a particular religious tradition, so that we can truly be pluralistic and inclusive. And we need a way to embrace citizenship and civility. And I have a lot of trouble with the word civility. That's another conversation, because I believe it's very colonial. But we need a way to create citizens. How do we do it? So this is where you start seeing the rise of humanism starting to become more into the popular concept, right? The UN Council on Human Rights.
Yes.
How do we talk about human rights in a way that's not based in the Bible or the Quran or in the Talmud, but it's actually it can be accessed by anyone from any faith tradition. And you also see an interest in the rise in civil religion. So the idea that we can actually think about citizenship as a religion. And scholars have proposed different ways of doing this, actually like making a church that's centered around democracy. And this is really fun. Recently, a new organization has been founded called the Church of Universal Suffrage that has a creed all based around voting rights as being a religious right? And I follow the founder of this organization. The name escapes me at the moment. He talked about actually studying the Satanic Temple, the Church of Satan, to gain inspiration for his creed and how he wrote the Church of Universal Suffrage belief structure.
Interesting.
And as some people may not know this, but the Church of Satan they don't actually believe in Satan. Mm-hmm. They believe in advocating for religious freedom, even for atheists. So there's a lot of crossover between there. But the Church of Universal Suffrage is an interesting way to approach democracy as religion. For those of us who can't ascribe to a religious tradition, how do we still be good people in the world and have right relationship? How do we create ideological structures that can stand in place of religion to hold enemy at bay? Because what we're seeing right now is such a fracturing of our society. Yeah. We are structureless in ways that, frankly, very scary to a lot of us. Yeah. So what do we hang on to? What can we build that will take the place of that former foundation that's cracking?
Powerful. Melody, every good religion has its prophets. What is your prophecy for the future with regards to social ethics, discourse, and humanity?
I mentioned at the top of the show I'm becoming very interested in Druidry, and that might sound a little woo-woo, and that's fine if you feel that way. It's maybe not for everyone, but what makes me really drawn to it is that it's all spirituality centered around the care of the earth. Mm-hmm. And I think that if we can start thinking that direction, I think in our current age of ecological crisis, this is one of the highest needs that we have, is for people to understand our fundamental, and I think mystical connection to the earth, the need we have to be in harmony with the earth. It's very hard to be in harmony with the earth and not be in harmony with the people who inhabit it. It really goes together. So I think if we can come back to environmentalism and ecological reverence and caring for our collective home, I think if I'm going to prophesy anything, I think that is the biggest need in the coming decades. And some of the people who are doing the most incredible work in environmental protection are indigenous activists from native tribes, working on things like water protection and protecting our oceans and our land conservation. And that sounds like a really niche direction to go, but I think if those of us who struggle with traditional religion like I do, or professing faith in a God or a theology or a theological religious structure, I think for me, that's something I can really root and ground into. That's something I can get behind, because the natural world is tangible, it's physical, it's here and now, and there's a deep and utter need to conserve. And the wars of the future will be fought over natural resources. They already are being fought. Millions of people are being displaced because of climate change. Yeah. So I think if we can structure spirituality around care for the earth, I really don't think we can go wrong.
Melody, this has been a rich conversation, and the beauty of it is that we really have only scratched the surface. For those that want to learn more about you, what you're doing, and hear other conversations that you might be having, where can they locate you and how can they connect with you?
Thanks for asking. My social handle across social media platforms is Melody Stanford Martin, all one word. You can also check out my website, bravetalkproject.com. Like I mentioned, I am working on a new book project. It's brand new. It's not even announced yet. It's all about deconstruction. And I'm interviewing 100 people about their experience with deconstruction and what they went through. And I'm finding some really fascinating results around times when our beliefs and values shift. And I just hope that listeners can understand that's a normal part of human existence. We can't wrap ourselves in bubble wrap. This is something that almost happens to us. And if your faith structure has crumbled for any reason, know that you're not alone. And a lot of people go through it, and you will get through it. There are good things on the other side of it if that's happening to you right now.
It's a powerful message. Melody, it has been great taking a ride with you today. Thank you so much for joining us. And for everyone tuning in, if you liked this episode, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple or a comment on YouTube. And I shall see you next time for another trip down the Purpose Highway. When you're racing down the Purpose Highway, we want to make sure you're healthy and happy every step of the way. That's why we're proud to partner with It's NOLA, 21st century plant-based healthy granola snack bites made with real ingredients and audacious flavor. It's NOLA crafts small batch hand-rolled granola balls that are vegan, gluten-free, and naturally low in sugar. It's NOLA's delightful bites come in 3 flavors: luscious cranberry coconut, sassy mango masala, and dark, decadent, chewy chocolate. It's NOLA is available to both individual customers and for wholesale accounts at itsnola.com. That's ITSNOLA.com. Guests on this show are already enjoying this delicious snack. Check out It's NOLA's website for yourself and find out how good it is.